of August 23, 1914, at the Mons Condé Canal, Belgium. General Alexander von Kluck's First Army, 150,000 men, 600 guns, had been moving south through Belgium for 2 weeks without meaningful resistance. The Schlieffen Plan was running. The war was supposed to be won by Christmas. Kluck did not expect a fight at Mons. He expected a delay.
What he got was something his staff could not explain.
The 18th Division of 9th Corps pushed toward Nimy Bridge at 9 in the morning. They advanced in close column formation, the same assault doctrine that had worked in German maneuvers for a decade. The officers knew what machine gun fire sounded like. They had studied it. They had planned around it. What hit them did not sound like machine guns. It came too fast, too accurate, too individual. The sound overlapped. Men fell not in sweeping rows, but in specific places. 1 here, 2 there, 10 more before the smoke cleared. The 18th Division reported back that the British position at Nimy was defended by a battery of machine guns, perhaps 18 of them.
The 4th Royal Fusiliers had 2. The rest was a .303 rifle in the hands of a man who had spent years learning to fire it.
The weapon that broke the 18th Division's calculations at Nimy Bridge was not the weapon Britain had planned to fight a war with.
In 1899, the British Army went to South Africa and discovered what it did not know. The Boers were farmers. They were not professional soldiers. But they had Mausers, and they had spent their lives shooting game across open veldt at ranges that British soldiers had never been trained to engage. At Colenso, at Spion Kop, at Margersfontein, the British took casualties they could not explain. Men were being shot from positions they could not see, at distances their rifles could not accurately cover. The long Lee-Enfield, then in service, had a 30-inch barrel and a 10-round magazine, but its sights were imprecise beyond 400 yards. Boer marksmen with Mausers were engaging and hitting at ranges the British rifles could not reliably match. The lesson the British Army took from South Africa was specific. It was not that soldiers needed bigger guns or more ammunition. It was that soldiers needed to shoot faster and hit harder from prepared positions against an enemy advancing toward them. The Boer War had turned the British infantry engagement into a defensive rifle problem. The short magazine, Lee-Enfield Mk I, was introduced on January 1, 1904. The Mk III, the version that went to war in 1914, followed on January 26, 1907. The designers made 2 decisions that no other major army had made. First, a 10-round detachable box magazine, twice the capacity of the German Gewehr 98's fixed 5-round internal magazine. Second, a rear-locking bolt that cocked on the closing stroke rather than the opening stroke. That single mechanical difference, cocking on close rather than open, meant the experienced rifleman's hand travelled less and the action cycled faster in trained hands. The SMLE Mk III chambered the .303 British cartridge. It weighed 8 pounds 10 ounces loaded. Effective killing range 600 yards. Maximum range with sights 2,000 yards for mass volley fire. A trained infantryman could fire 15 aimed rounds per minute. That was the standard. The musketry regulations required it for classification as a first-class shot. What the regulations did not anticipate was what those soldiers would become by 1914. The German army in 1914 was not careless. It was the most technically sophisticated land force in Europe. Its officer corps had studied the Boer War, had watched the Russo-Japanese War, and had drawn considered conclusions about the future of infantry combat. Those conclusions were rational. Machine guns, the analysis showed, were what decided engagements of volume. Individual rifle fire, especially at ranges above 300 meters, was of secondary tactical importance. The Gewehr 98 was an excellent rifle. It was accurate, reliable, and chambered a cartridge with a muzzle velocity of 2,881 feet per second, significantly faster than the British .303's 2,060. German doctrine emphasized officer-called volley fire at distance, with infantry advancing in coordinated bounds. The Gewehr 98's 5-round magazine was considered adequate for this purpose.
Sustained individual rapid fire was not the German model. Machine guns would provide suppression. Rifles would provide aimed volley fire at specific targets and ranges called by officers. The system was logical. It was what the evidence suggested would work. What German doctrine had not modelled was the British professional. The BEF that arrived in France in August 1914 was not a conscript force. It was a long-service volunteer army, every man of whom had fired a minimum of 250 rounds per year to maintain his classification. Some had been at it for a decade. They had practiced something the Germans had not incorporated into their planning: the Mad Minute. Formally designated Practice Number 22, Rapid Fire, in the Musketry Regulations, Part 1, 1909, it required a soldier to fire 15 aimed rounds at a man-sized target at 300 yards in 60 seconds, starting with the rifle loaded. Scores of 30 rounds were not unusual among regular soldiers. In 1914, Sergeant Instructor Alfred Snoxall of the School of Musketry placed 38 rounds into a 12-inch target at 300 yards in 1 minute. 38. Aimed. The 18th Division arrived at Nimy Bridge on the morning of 23rd August 1914, expecting to face 2 machine guns and a handful of riflemen. They faced companies of men who could individually deliver what German staff planning had assigned only to machines. At Nimy Bridge, the 4th Royal Fusiliers, 1 battalion, 2 actual Vickers guns, held off 6 German battalions for 2 hours. The Middlesex Regiment held to their east. The reports that came back through the German chain of command did not describe rifle fire. They described machine gun batteries. The British battalions, German post-battle analysis estimated, must have had 18 machine guns each. The real number was 2. The German 18th Division fell back. It reorganized. It advanced again. By midday it was taking the same fire. The columns had advanced shoulder to shoulder in drill ground formation, presenting the kind of target a trained British rifleman could engage at 300 yards, with both eyes closed. German casualties along the Mons Canal on August 23, 1914. Approximately 5,000 killed and wounded. British casualties in the same engagement, approximately 1,600. The ratio was not accidental. The Germans were not surprised by British firepower in the abstract. They were surprised by British firepower from a rifle. This is where the story stops being about a rifle and starts being about a failure of imagination. The German army's doctrine assumed that individual rifle fire, however skilled, could not generate the sustained volume needed to stop a coordinated infantry advance. That assumption was mathematically sound when applied to any other rifle in European service. The Gewehr 98 loaded 5 rounds. A typical European conscript drills to fire perhaps 8 aimed rounds per minute. The French Lebel, comparable. The Austro-Hungarian Mannlicher, a 6-round internal magazine, slightly faster than the Mauser, but not substantially so. No other army in Europe had built a rifle whose bolt cycled on the closing stroke, whose 10-round magazine loaded from 2 5-round charger clips, and whose soldiers had been trained as a minimum standard, not as an elite skill, to fire 15 accurate rounds per minute after years of repetition with that specific action. The Lee action's rear-locking bolt required 60 degrees of rotation compared to the 90-degree rotation of the Mauser action. Shorter arc, less movement. The hand did not travel as far. On August 23, 1914, across a 20-mile front along the Mons Canal, that mechanical difference, 60 degrees versus 90, multiplied across 8 British battalions, each firing as fast as they were trained to fire, produced a volume of accurate fire that German infantry formation doctrine had no procedure for. The doctrine assumes that fire at that volume required machines. Machines could be targeted and destroyed. Men with rifles were distributed across a position. You could not neutralize them with counter-battery fire the way you could a machine gun emplacement. You had to close with them. Under the shock of British fire at Mons, German units were forced to adapt their approach mid-battle.
Officers who watched their men cut down in close column called for looser, more dispersed advances before noon. That change, the partial abandonment of close column formation under British fire, was itself a concession that the assault doctrine they had drilled was not adequate for what they were facing. The formation the German army had practiced for a decade was being modified in a single morning, under artillery, under machine guns, and under what 10 men with bolt-action rifles could do when a decade of training was behind every trigger pull. The dark reason German officers feared the British 303 Enfield was not the cartridge, it was not the magazine. It was that the SMLE had been designed around a specific doctrinal insight, that the infantryman himself, not the machine, was the primary fire unit. And that insight had been drilled into the British Army so thoroughly that a rifle in British hands did not behave the way German doctrine assumed rifles behaved. German planning at Mons had assigned machine guns the suppression role. The British had made every man a machine gun. The consequences of Mons ran through the rest of the war in ways that are difficult to see in isolation. The German army that fought the Battle of the Marne in September 1914 was not attacking in the close column formations it had used at Mons. Mons was one of the engagements that demonstrated how costly those formations could be against trained riflemen and modern supporting fire. A lesson reinforced across multiple encounters in those opening weeks. General Smith-Dorrien's Second Corps, 75,000 men against 150,000, had held the canal line for 12 hours and inflicted a casualty ratio that German staff officers had not built into their operational planning. The SMLE kept producing the same result every time conditions matched. A trained British rifleman in a prepared position, infantry advancing in the open. At Le Cateau on 26th of August 1914, Smith-Dorrien turned and fought rather than continue the retreat, partly because his soldiers still had ammunition and rifles they knew how to use. German formations advancing against British positions at Le Cateau ran into the same wall of aimed bolt-action fire. The retreat continued, but not because the rifles had failed. Consider the arithmetic. A German Gewehr 98 with a 5-round internal magazine in the hands of a conscript trained to fire controlled volleys at officer-cooled ranges could deliver perhaps 8 to 10 aimed rounds per minute in sustained fire. An SMLE Mk III with a 10-round magazine in the hands of a British regular delivered 15 as a baseline. 30 was achievable. The 10 men of a British section could, at their trained rate, produce 150 aimed rounds per minute. A German section with Gewehr 98s could produce perhaps 80 to 100 at comparable skill levels, and their training did not emphasize sustained individual rapid fire. The British soldier at Mons carried 150 rounds of 303 in his pouches. At 15 rounds per minute, the minimum standard, he could sustain aimed fire for 10 minutes before needing resupply. At close range, those rounds landed with precision. At longer ranges, the sheer density of incoming fire did something else. It told the men on the receiving end that they were facing something they could not locate, could not suppress, and could not count. To attacking German troops, it felt like machine gun fire. It came from individual positions, not fixed emplacements. You could not silence it with counter-battery fire because there was no battery. There were just men. The men who wrote those reports were not stupid. They were applying a logical framework to what they saw. Their framework just had no category for what the SMLE in British hands actually was. By the end of 1914, the regulars who had carried SMLEs at Mons were mostly casualties. The rifle outlasted them. Over 3.8 million Lee-Enfields would be manufactured by the end of the First World War, issued to soldiers whose training increasingly fell short of the pre-war standard, because there was no time and not enough instructors, and the army that had produced Snoxall and the Mad Minute records had been consumed by attrition inside 6 months. The German army never faced the old contemptibles again in quite the same form. The SMLE remained. The soldiers who had made it what it was at Mons were gone. There is something precise to understand about what happened at Mons, and it requires letting go of the idea that weapons explain battles. German planning in August 1914 was not naive. It correctly identified machine guns as the decisive instrument of volume fire. It correctly identified the Gewehr 98 as an excellent individual weapon. What it failed to calculate was that another army had made a different decision, not about the machine, but about the man. The British Army had spent the years after South Africa investing in the human component of the rifle, not just the mechanical one. Musketry training, repetition, classification, the expectation that every soldier, not just specialist marksmen, would be capable of sustained, accurate fire. When the two doctrines met at Mons, the German one was rational and the British one was correct. That gap between what planners model and what soldiers actually produce appears in every generation's account of its own preparations for war. The weapons change, the formations change, the technology changes. What does not change is the institutional tendency to build doctrine around what equipment can do and to underestimate what training can make ordinary men capable of. The SMLE survived in service until 1957. Variants remained in use well into the 1990s. It outlasted 3 major wars, multiple replacement programs, and 2 generations of soldiers who were convinced that something newer would work better. None of them were entirely wrong. None of them were more right than the rifle itself. The bolt action that won at Mons was designed around a single insight, that in the critical moment, the man pulling the trigger matters more than the specification sheet says he should. Some things the army got right before anyone knew they would need to. If this is the kind of history that belongs on your screen, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next video is waiting.